Well, I'm very, very happy to say I've got Major Terry Griffin to talk to us today from the Rhodesian Corps of Engineers. He ended up commanding, what is it, one squadron?
Terry? Yeah, one engineer squadron in Bulawayo.
At the end of the war, but saw an enormous amount of action and a lot of what was going on from the engineers' point of view. And I just know Terry's going to be able to fill a big gap in the program because we haven't had anybody of his background to talk to us so far. So thanks very much, Terry, for joining us.
Hannes, thank you. I do appreciate the offer. And as I've said to you on several occasions, I've had my arm twisted, I've had my brow beaten. Plenty of people have been putting pressure on me to say, hey, get hold of Hannes. We need to have the engineers exposed, if I can put it that way, in your video clips and things. So yes, after a couple of months of negotiations, thank you for your hospitality and the opportunity to have a chat now.
Thanks, Terry. And I know you've repeated it many times to me, the fact that you don't want to be seen to be speaking about yourself. You want to talk about the regiment and about some of the wonderful soldiers that you served with. And it's on that basis that I know you agreed to talk. It's a history about many people, and you're very well placed to put that on the record. So thanks again.
Well, thank you again. And yes, you are quite right. And as I mentioned to you several times and to all your viewers, the memory bank is only so good. I can attest to obviously quite a few of the facts that I will be referring to. A lot of them I've had to get confirmation from other people. Are they 100% correct? No, they're not. There will be some facts and figures that are incorrect. So please, guys, understand that between yourself, Hannes, and myself, we've tried to put together something that is as accurate as possible. So please, let's not have some derogatory comments. And I apologize profusely if I've got some facts and figures wrong, which I know I have, but bear with us, at least we'll have the gist of it.
Okay, Terry, thanks. Let's start with the basic structure of the Corps of Engineers at the time that you joined.
Each brigade had a combat squadron under command and in support of the brigade. So towards the end of the war, obviously 4 brigade came into being. So there were 4 combat squadrons around the country. Plus we had the 5 near support with Redcliffe. They had under command outfits like the workshop troop, the dog troop, the National Service Field Troop, the plant troop, and obviously people like the pookie troop came under command of them, although pookie were based up at Pomona. Now the plant troop, out of interest, a lot of people don't realize that we had a fairly large selection of bulldozers, graders, 20-ton low beds, etc., and those guys did a lot of work out in the operational area where the roads department guys, and I don't blame them, didn't want to go. So the plant troop had the kit and equipment to do the necessary out there. Boat squadron, albeit based at Kariba, also from the Orbat situation, came under 5 support squadron. And then there were 2 Minefield squadrons, 6 and 7, also based up Pomona way, that came under command of 5 support. In conjunction with the combat squadrons, one of the main functions of the Corps was the School of Military Engineering, which was based in Bulawayo. And the school did a tremendous job. Basically, all the national servicemen, as they came in, they went through a combat engineer class 3 course. All the other courses that the Corps ran with respect to training and improving the combat efficiency of our own people and outside units when they sent people in for training. The school itself was very, very active, and the final, let's say, decision on training came from the school, and some of the finest instructors and experienced combat engineers used to rotate from the school. So we had a continual flow of people who had been in the operational area and then came back to do the training. Out of interest, my figures are 75% of the Corps was made up of, as we know, volunteer African soldiers, and 25% of European soldiers. That was the regulars. And the regulars, we were quite lucky enough to have quite a few lads who came and joined us from the UK, some from America, a couple from all sorts of other countries and things, and they brought those combat engineer skills with them. They had further training at what we call SME, School of Military Engineering. And yes, as we go through this lot, I'll often refer to an Englishman or a Scotsman or whatever it is, an American. But these guys came in and integrated themselves there. Then each of the squadrons had a territorial element. And for what it's worth, the largest territorial element was in one squadron in Bulawayo. It just happened to be that that's where they were. So effectively, 75% African soldiers, 25% European soldiers regular, and then the rest made up of territorials. That's a very brief, and I stress very brief, resume, if I can put it that way, of what the Corps constituted. There is also a slight conundrum, if I can put it this way. We often had orders or instructions from Army headquarters, which may have been contrary to brigade, but our support was initially geared to our brigade and our brigade commander. But then obviously if there was something on the go that Army needed more combat engineers for a given task, then we would accordingly provide those guys. But we would then keep the brigadier informed that we were now running short, as it were, of troops because they were all going to some other task or whatever it may be.
Terry, a big task that was given to the engineers was the cordon sanitaire. Just tell us about the background and the actual mechanics of putting that minefield in, which was designed to protect mainly the eastern border after Mozambique changed power and Frelimo came to power.
Yeah, I don't know where the original idea came from. There was a border minefield committee up at KG6, and they were basically the people who made all the decisions. One of the most interesting things is people often ask me, how long was the minefield? How much in kilometers? And out of interest, the total length of the minefield was just under 700 kilometers, albeit not all in one go. And I was just looking the other day and sort of trying to assess 700 odd kilometers, and I looked at a road map, and if you took the main road from Bulawayo via Salisbury to Umtali, that's round figure 600 kilometers. So that road plus another 100 kilometers was the total extent of the minefield. And I think you can see now it wasn't a small task at all. Hence and I referred to them earlier, not only the combat squadrons in their various brigades were involved in the initial phases of the minefield, but there were two minefield squadrons, 6 and 7, whose sole task was putting the minefield in. The early days, and I stress the early days of the minefield, we were probably, you can say, learning from our mistakes. And a delegation very secretly, I don't know who they were, went over to Israel and had a good look at the way the Israelis were putting together their border security. And they came back with a few ideas, nothing terribly exciting. The biggest thing there, as they said, was it's a very small border that Israel needs to contend with. And one of the aspects of an obstacle, because that's what the minefield is, an obstacle, is for an obstacle to be efficient, it needs to be covered by fire. Now, the Israelis had plenty of time to put up pillboxes and all sorts of things, and every couple of 100 meters, there's a pillbox manned with 3 or 4 guys with machine guns and everything. And if you take the 700 odd kilometers and the ground that we had to lay the minefield in, it was an absolute impossibility to cover the minefield with fire. Hence, as an obstacle, and people will argue this until the cows come home and go back again, was it effective? Well, it was as effective as we could make it. And we certainly didn't have the kit and equipment, let alone the manpower, to compete with the Israelis. The initial minefield we relied on, as we did throughout, for the Tetsi guys who were very efficient at erecting fences. That was something they just did with their eyes closed. And what I would call a standard game fence of around about 8 foot high with a Y configuration at the top of the fence with barbed wire and stuff is what they were installing. So we would then follow behind them, laying our mines. The Tetsi guys obviously had protection, and the initial minefield, we put in our heavy plant and equipment, our bulldozers, our graders and everything, and we cleared all the vegetation. And the strict adherence to call it a 25-meter gap between the home side fence and call it the enemy side fence was maintained. And throughout the minefield, 3 rows of mines were laid. So you can imagine, call it row A, B, and C, A being the furthest. We relied on officers and to a large extent senior NCOs to keep an eye on everything, because we then laid the minefield in echelon, if you know what I mean. Row A were way ahead of row B, way ahead of row C, so that in the event of an evacuation needing to happen very quickly from the minefield, you could, if you were laying from, in my expression, from my right to left, you could do a left turn of 90 degrees and get the hell out of the minefield without any danger. The other aspect which we had in the initial phases was after laying, and we didn't have the plowshares in the initial phase, after laying and you're trying to camouflage everything, as you're progressing, one of the biggest problems was in that part of the world, up in Mukumbura, were the ground hornbills, or otherwise known as turkey buzzards. These guys were following about a kilometer or so behind the laying team, and they would see where you had laid a mine and the soil was slightly discolored to the rest of it because it was now drying out or something. And these birds decided that this was somewhere where there was some food, so they would peck at these areas, and the next thing, there's the laying team, and behind us there's half a dozen explosions as these turkey buzzards were blowing themselves up because they were pecking the mines that had recently been buried. After a short space of time, we realized we were actually not doing the right thing, coupled with, as soon as the first terrorist incursions occurred, they would immediately arrive at the fence. They'd see a lovely cleared area, 25 meters wide, and they had various breaching methods. Obviously, cut the fence on their side, come through, and I've sent you a couple of photographs and things you'll see there. They used shovels and basically what I would call elephant pad shoveling, moving forward, and in no time at all, they're through 25 meters and into the country. Obviously, we would pick up where these breaches had occurred, and if we could get there in time, then there would be a follow-up from an infantry unit or something, but it was not successful. So a think tank, rethink the whole thing, and the general consensus was, do not clear vegetation. Leave the vegetation intact, gives it a bit of camouflage and concealment, and the 25-meter definitive distance between the fences must just meander. We will still keep to 3 rows, but the distances between the fence was unknown, and the Tetsi guys could then erect the fence. I wouldn't say necessarily at their leisure, but following the lay of the land to be able to put the fence in as effectively as possible. So in some instances, the fence distances between home side and enemy side may have been up to nearly 2 kilometers from the original 25 meters. Then, of course, with the laying and keeping the vegetation intact, became a very, very onerous task for the either the officer or the senior NCO to keep an eye on everything, because you didn't always have visual contact with the guys that were laying. And the general system, and I'm not going to go into all the technical details, was obviously for the first group to go ahead, and they may well be, let's call it the diggers, and then behind them came the guys who were carrying the mines, and then behind them came the group who were arming and placing the mines in the relevant holes. And, from that point of view, a echelon with A, B, and C group or rows would then continue through until that day was completed and you'd done so many kilometers or whatever it may be. Also, once we had now brought in the plowshare stake, where the actual mechanism was, had 3 mines around it, call it the 9, 12, and 3 o'clock, as did the anchor stake. The approximate distance of the wire, about 30 odd feet. And the switch used in the plowshare was a pull release switch. So if you cut the wire, it would detonate the plowshare. And if you went into the wire with sufficient force, that would also detonate the plowshare. In between all of these, obviously the anti-personnel mines, and then the plowshares were always, we tried to angle them that they would not be, let's say, blasting off towards home base. Occasionally, behind would get a bird and detonate the plowshare, which would obviously get his attention. And so there were many, many false alarms. But the breaching did get a lot more onerous for the terrorists than the original phase. Coupled with, as far as I can remember, the laying of the actual minefield, it was structured in such a way that you had, if you were to cross over, if you can understand what I'm going, in a straight line and not deviate off that line, you would inevitably hit either a plowshare tripwire or you would step on a mine. So the terrorists had to jack up the way they were breaching. And after a while, we actually found out through more from SB than anything that they would try and get to the minefield first thing in the morning, because very often you could pick up dew on the tripwire of the plowshare. So their whole breaching method had to change. Was the second phase a lot more effective than the first? Absolutely. Further to that, we can always discuss how effective the minefield was. Very often when we would then patrol on the home fence to attain, maybe you'd heard a couple of explosions in the night or something. If there had been a breach and there had been terrorist casualties, they would remove their casualties. We had no idea how many casualties they had sustained. Want us to know how effective the minefield was, rather just keep it quiet there. So occasionally we would find, and I don't want to be derogatory, body parts and things around, but it was very difficult to ascertain how many casualties had actually taken place. Certain areas were very, very difficult to mine, and speed was not necessarily of the essence, but it was a case of trying to get the mine in as neat, and I stress as neat a pattern as possible, because each of the rows had a pegged barbed wire traveling down. That was the safe lane. If you went to the minefield for whatever the reason, you would look for these barbed wire things that had been pegged down and you knew you could walk on there safely. This was a couple of meters off where the mines and things were. And effectively, if you think about it, that one of the most dangerous jobs is not in the laying of the minefield. It's actually going back again to reap that has been detonated to be replaced, or the integrity of the minefield actually will depreciate over time and the effectiveness then becomes zero. I did liaise with a couple of SB guys in the Northeast on a few, and it was interesting to note the terrorists feared aircraft the most. And secondly, they feared crossing the minefield. So did the minefield produce what it wanted to? Difficult one. We weren't necessarily looking at taking out as many casualties as we could. We were looking at diverting the crossing routes easier for the infantry units and Grey Scouts, etc., when the incursion took place to do a follow-up. Also, a lot of people seem to think that an anti-personnel mine is there to kill you. Well, it's not there to kill you. It's actually there to maim you. And any guy who's been through School of Infantry and done the courses there will tell you that a maimed casualty is far more to look after than a dead body. So effectively, anti-personnel mine is not there designed to kill you. It is there to maim you. And then I can understand an incoming group may well do a 180 and get the hell out and take their casualties with them and say, to hell with that, we'll try a crossing at another time. So how effective was it to move internal groups coming in and out? Certainly in the eastern districts, which I didn't have any experience of, I had feedback that they had stopped incursions in certain areas. I am aware, because the SB guy had told me, that the propaganda, put it this way, for new groups coming in. They would tell them all sorts of things, how wonderful it was in Rhodesia. They were winning the war. There was nothing to worry about, etc., etc. However, when they got to the minefield with a new group, there would always be, call it a few of the old and bold with them. And I am aware of 2 occasions, there may have been more, where a mutiny took place on the enemy side of the minefield, where the new guys turned around to the old guys and said, hey, you never told us about this lot, about crossing fences and all sorts of funny things here. We don't like this. And as I say, I'm aware of 2 incidents where the new guys actually took out the old guys, did a 180 and returned back to wherever it is they came from and just said, oh, well, you know, we got into the minefield and the guys got killed, so we've come back again. So there was a lot of resistance for them to cross the minefield. They didn't like it. So did the minefield create a lot of casualties? Casualties, I think you can say may be the word, but a lot of deaths, not necessarily so. But that wasn't, as I say, the aim of the minefield at that time. The one aspect which we, out of the beginning, we, let's say, maintain our Geneva Convention criteria, put up so many mine warning signs per kilometer, plus this, plus that, plus the next thing. And the general consensus after a while was, well, they're not playing by the rules, so maybe we shouldn't play by the rules either. And in the 1 squadron area, which came under my command from Bulawayo, in the Kariba forest area, which a lot of guys from that part of the world will know, the enemy, let's call it north side fence, was dispensed with. And the idea was we just said, look, it's quite difficult to put in that fence there, but effectively the tours will only know they're in the minefield when they have a bang going off, which we thought was a fairly good idea. We'll see how it goes. Unfortunately, in that part of the world, there are numerous herds of elephant and buffalo. And unfortunately, inevitably, poor animal into the minefield. And go in, my expression, the most dangerous part of a mine back and replacing stuff. They caused mayhem in that section of the minefield. I've watched and listened to a couple of your clips with Don Price. I don't know if you referred to it, but effectively, Don Price and my good mate, the late Graham Wiltshire, who was National Parks up at the Falls, jumped in a chopper, came down to Decca. We had a briefing, and then they took off and culled elephant and buffalo in that area of Kariba forest. I cannot remember the exact figures. Was it 20 elephant and 30 buffalo, or the other way around? I'm not sure. The idea being to let those animals know, rather you get the hell out of the area and don't stick around here, because they were absolutely decimating the minefield there. Then inevitably, if you think of it, during, let's say, drought times, the fence protected the vegetation that it enclosed, if I can put it that way, with the result that it became a, let's put it, a wildlife larder for food and sustenance. As a result, elephant would break through the fence to get to what was all the nice new juicy stuff growing between the fences, because it hadn't been consumed by the animals in that area. And certain areas, yes, the elephants did break through the fence, and they did get, unfortunately, severely injured, and not many of them actually succumbed. We actually had to take them out. But then you'd get things like kudu would jump the fence and get in there to browse on the nice new mapani shoots, which had been protected by the fence. Inevitably, and there's many guys can tell you this, you're doing a patrol in the mornings down the fence, and there is a carcass. The carcass is full up with vultures. Now the vultures flown in, let's call it empty, so they can land right next to the carcass. You driving along or you walking along, and you now disturb the vultures. They're now heavily laden with carrion, and they cannot take off vertically. They've got to have a running takeoff. And the number of vultures that went into tripwires and things, and plowshares were blasting off left, right, and center. Guys were taking cover, because obviously a plowshare is not dissimilar to a claymore mine. There's shrapnel flying everywhere. There's feathers flying everywhere. There's dead vultures everywhere. So there were aspects within the confines of the fence that the animals that existed in that area unfortunate to aspects within the minefield, be it the plowshare, be it the anti-personnel mines and things. And then sure enough, we had to go back and replace these nated mines. Integrity, as I said, of the minefield graded substantially. The other aspect, which is not for the faint-hearted either, is suddenly, particularly in the southeast and in the far east, there would be an order that a unit, doesn't matter who it is, SAS, Grey Scouts, RAR, whatever, needed to get through the minefield to go on an external. So then the guys had to get there and do a breach. So now they're breaching through an existing minefield to create a gap that the troops could go then through, and most times keep the gap and return. Again, very dangerous, going back into an existing minefield to create a breach. And there were occasions where a few casualties on our side occurred, not the least of which the OC then of 2 Engineer Squadron, Chris Blackwell. That's how he lost his leg, having assumed that the breach had been completed for whoever the unit was that was going external, and Chris stepped on a mine. So dangerous work going back into the minefield, coupled with the other aspect, which basically the minefield stats are, I would say, impossible to get. How many terrorists were accounted for, etc., etc., etc. I have no idea, but certainly the jury is still out. Was the minefield effective? Did the minefield do what the aim was? I don't know. It was 700 kilometers worth of a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and many combat engineers will tell you the time they spent in the minefield was nerve-wracking, to put it bluntly.
Terry, just roughly how many mines per kilometer, or did that vary? How many plowshares, how many AP mines?
You couldn't really calculate it. What we were trying to get at was that if you took a 1 meter gap from the enemy fence to the home fence, 1 meter, and you walked in a straight line, you would hit an anti-personnel mine. There were some statisticians and some people who would have been able to give you the exact figures of mines put in and this and that and the next. I don't have those figures. Okay. But if you were to walk in a straight line, as I say, from fence to fence, you would inevitably hit a mine.
Terry, I just want to take you back to something you mentioned, because I think it's created a lot of confusion, and there have been some pretty wild stories. But just explain again what Don Price and Graham Wilshire were tasked to do there. I mean, the word got out that this was some sort of illegal activity, but they were there under orders to, were they destroying wounded elephant, or was this an exercise in getting elephant out the minefield? Basically
to, more than anything, give them a hell of a fright and force them out of that area. The elephant, dare I say it, a lot more intelligent than the buffalo, and they got the message very quickly. This is not a place that they want to be in, and they did move further north. As I say, why the figure of 20 elephant and 30 buffaloes in the back of my mind, I can't recall exactly the figures. The buffalo didn't get the message, and in no time at all, they were back again. So it was to basically let them know, hey, we do not want you in this part of the world. Get out of here. And yes, there were, let's not be funny, piles of dead elephant and dead buffalo on that side of the fence, and the message got out, certainly to the elephant. But a few months later, they were back again. So we discussed putting in a north side fence there to prevent this further, and it just never got done.
Terry, moving on, everybody who was involved in the war remembers the pookies and the pookie drivers, and I certainly remember looking at these guys and thinking, jeepers, I don't particularly want that job. Unsung heroes, in a way. They performed an incredibly important role at great personal risk.
Hannes, that's, dare I say, putting it mildly, who wants to drive around in a steel coffin 200 meters or so beyond your support, which is the convoy behind you, in the heat of summer, knowing full well that every terrorist in that area is watching you and wondering what are you up to? but you are quite right. It was a phenomenal little machine. And dare I say it, the old expression of necessity is the mother of invention. And between the engineering outfit in Salisbury and all the facts and figures, otherwise we'll be here for a month of Sundays. But the development of that machine was absolutely outstanding. And I've got the facts and figures here to read it. It was a purely Rhodesian invented machine, and that we're extremely proud of. And since then, call it demining companies around the world have adopted these things. The pookie is the first mine detecting vehicle capable of finding a mine whilst traveling up to 8 kilometers an hour. So when you look, sappers with mine detectors to the road, it is going to take you for 8 to do 1 kilometer. Convoy sitting behind you waiting to get into the operational area. Put a pookie in front and you can drive, let's say, comfortably at 50 kilometers an hour. That convoy is going to get to destination on time, and all the staff officers could have done the time and space programs and say, right, leave Mount Darwin at this time and you're going to get to Mukumbura or wherever it is at that time, because the pookie will be in front of you. The psychological aspect of the pookie was another point that came out towards the end of the war. Hardly a convoy commander interested in traveling along a dirt road unless he knew there was a pookie who was going to be leading it. So to continue here, from 1972 to 1980, there were 2,500 detonations of landmines, normally the Soviet TM series, killing 632 people and injuring 4,400. The mining of roads increased as the war intensified, and in 1978, there were 894 mines detonated or recovered at a rate of 2.44 mines per day. In 1979, 2,089 mines were dealt with at a rate of 5.72 mines per day. Between 1976 and 1980, built at a cost of less than repairing a mine-damaged vehicle, 68 pookies detected 550 mines. Now, the stats I have here is the average, and I stress the average cost of repair to a vehicle that had hit a mine was $17,000. The cost to build a pookie was $11,000. So immediately you're seeing the, even if it's just the economic aspect here, to continue with on here, of the 68 pookies, 12 pookies were damaged in ambushes by command detonated landmines or rockets. Not one pookie detonated a mine.
Wow.
The call it the Formula One tackies, the slicks, produced 3 pounds per square inch pressure downwards. Jeepers, you need 5 on a bloody anti-personnel mine. Forget a anti-tank mine. So of the 680 pookies that were built, I beg your pardon, the 68 pookies built, not one set off a mine. Yes, there were ambushes, command detonated mines, and unfortunately, on the one occasion, the terrorists fired an RPG rocket that went through the armored windscreen, killing the pookie driver. He, as far as I know, is the only casualty. And when Zanla realized that the pookie was blunting their landmine offenses, they ambushed it more and more frequently. They then changed their tactics to allow the pookie to go through and then ambush the convoy. As far as they were concerned, that was almost indestructible. However, at a later stage, we had a 24-barrel spider mounted on the pookie, which took a 12-bore shotgun cartridge. And the pookie driver inside had a cord that he could pull and set off these 24-barrel spider shotgun thing. The ambushing and stuff took place within, I understand, 10 to 11 meters from the side of the road. So they were quite effective, these spiders, blasting buckshot all over the place. And again, the terrorists didn't like this. And the idea was let the pookie go through rather, and we'll ambush the convoy behind. The other aspect, which we were not going to let on about, was they believed the pookie could detect all types of mines, including the non-metallic mines. We never let them know that that, in fact, was not the case. They assumed that the pookie was just an unbelievable vehicle with, dare I say, one guy in there, and their mining would be effectively neutralized. It became so effective in certain areas that the pookies were transported with tarpaulin coverings on the back of a vehicle to a given destination, so that the let's say the terrorist intelligence organization wouldn't let on as to where the pookie had gone to. And if you take that road that comes down from, I would say, Rutenga through to Boli, take a right and head all the way down to Villa Salazar, that was like Minefield Alley. First pookie that went on there, I think the guy got so sick and tired of lifting mines because they just detected mines left, right, and center. On the one demonstration on the initial stages outside Mount Darwin, I was not there. The pookie went down the road, and within a couple of kilometers, the guy had detected 5 mines, and all the top brass that were there were just so impressed, basically said, get out there and make more and more and more of these vehicles. Pookie Troop probably are not recognized for the amount of work they did, not only the physical work, but as I said, the psychological work and the psychology of a convoy commander knowing he had a pookie in front of him was phenomenal. And at that speed of, I'm going to say an average of nearly 50 Ks an hour, the pookies did a marvelous job. There were certain areas the pookie very often battled to go, which were off-road tracks. And occasionally we then brought in members of the dog troop, who were, as I mentioned a lot earlier, under command of 5 Support Squadron from Redcliffe. And the dogs and their dog handlers would then clear that set of road where it was difficult for the pookie to go. And I would like to point out that we didn't only have male dog handlers, we had quite a lot of female dog handlers. And a very iconic photograph is of then Corporal Beryl Sheehan with her dog Bracken in the operational area detecting mines. I don't know, but I will say that the engineers, the RWS ladies who were dog troop handlers, were probably the only RWS allowed to be what I call right at the sharp end in the operational area. Did they have a contact? Not that I'm aware of. We did find the dogs were incredible, and I won't go into how they were trained and so on and so forth, because that's a long session in itself. But it was very evident that dogs, particularly in summer, suffered severely from the heat, and they needed more water than their handlers. And the handler had to be very aware of when the dog was now only pleasing the handler and actually not doing the job properly. So between the pookie, between the dogs, and between the normal sapper with his mine detector walking roads and things, there was an amount of clearance done, but nothing came close to what the pookie did and what the pookie achieved. And it's going to go down in history, and I'm sure it will, justifiably, as the first mine detecting vehicle, which most of the drivers were national servicemen. Were they volunteers? I would assume most of them were volunteers, because as you mentioned earlier, and I agreed with you, who the hell wants to get into a steel coffin that's like a oven in the middle of summer and drive at 50 Ks down the road looking for mines, and then it's your job to now go and remove that mine. I would like to refer back, though, to the one casualty, as I mentioned, which was an RPG rocket fired, and it hit the windscreen and unfortunately killed the pookie driver, who was not a national serviceman. He was actually a regular. And that was Corporal Michael Lawrence. And if I may read his citation for his posthumous Bronze Cross. Corporal Michael David Kilcoyne Lawrence was assigned to the Mine Detection Vehicle Troop 2 Engineer Squadron in May 1978 and served with this troop until his death in April 1979. During this period, Corporal Lawrence was almost continuously deployed on mine detection duties, and he declined to take any periods of rest and recuperation, preferring to remain in the operational area. He personally located and accounted for 39 landmines and booby traps during his service. 11 of the booby traps, which he accounted for, were electrical devices that were very sensitive and hazardous to disarm. Corporal Lawrence was ambushed 14 times whilst leading convoys in the operational area. He was killed by terrorists in an ambush on the 8th of April, 1979. Throughout his tour of duty, he rendered exceptional service to his country and showed great courage, resourcefulness, and devotion to duty beyond that which would normally be called along to do. That epitomizes, dare I say it, the pookie drivers. And hardly any recognition came to the pookie drivers, but their, dare I say it, unbelievable citation, posthumous award of a Bronze Cross to a man who gave his life to the country.
Well, I'm very pleased we got that on the record, Terry. Terry, let's move on to the boat squadron, which was also part of the Corps and obviously a different role, but again, playing a very important part in defending the country.
Can I just go back one there? On the pookie side, what a lot of people don't know is that a couple of landmines were also laid on some bush airstrip. Monday, the 19th of February, 1979, a Mr. B.R. Gardner, internal affairs pilot, was killed with a couple of assistants when their light aircraft detonated a landmine on a gravel runway airstrip near Mrewa. The aspect here was suddenly the Air Force basically said, whoa, these dirt runways are now becoming a possible landmine situation. Can we have pookies to clear? Obviously, the answer, without being derogatory to the Air Force, and I never would be, was we couldn't afford to send a pookie to every dirt runway and leave it there stationed permanently. So the Brains Trust sat down together and a bicycle-operated detecting vehicle was developed. Somebody with a sense of humor called it a Foxtrot Uniform 2. And that little FU2, how many were built, I don't know, but they went to these outlying airstrips and the Air Force guys, I guess, would pedal the bicycle thing up and down, check and see, and if anything came across, they would call in one of the engineers to come and take it out. Did they find any more? I'm not aware of them, but yes, that was the further development from the pookie troop.
So this was a bicycle equipped with sensors?
Correct, yes. It was just two little pans and a bicycle configuration in the middle, and the guy sits on the bicycle and pedals up and down the runway with the pans active, obviously, to try and see if it'll pick up anything that would otherwise have had a aircraft in trouble, which would have detonated a mine on the runway.
I never knew that. Terry, tell us about the boat squadron and the goings-on Kariba.
Obviously, Kariba was viewed as a major crossing point at times, and as I remember when I got posted up there, the lake is 275 kilometers long, 5,500 square k's of water, and 32 kilometers at its widest point. So the decision was made to formulate boat squadron. At that time, I would say the only available waterborne craft with a police reserve, marine division, and people like that. So initially, it was a combination of strike craft was sent up, which had been manufactured locally, fiberglass-wise. But how we managed it, I don't know. We had in the 24-footers, 2 Volvo Penta V8 inboard-outboard motors. Sanctions busting, whatever you want to call it, these were brilliant motors, and how they came into the country, I don't know. There were smaller strike craft that had 105 Chrysler outboard motors on them. But initially, when I got up there in 77, it was very much a learning curve still. We didn't quite know all the aspects of how things were going to operate. A lot of the strike craft were open. When I say open, it was just a boat and a driver and 3 guys in there, ostensibly a machine gun on the front, 1 on the port, 1 on the starboard, normally the MAGs, and away they went, be it fair weather or foul. Not terribly effective. The guys were open to all the elements. And then eventually the development of, call it a cabin, on the big strike craft was then manufactured. And this at least gave a bit of protection to the crew, coupled with you could then have a mounting on the front of the boat, which you could either have a MAG or preferably a 5.0 Browning with a steel pipe going through to the decking below. Once the development had taken place of the strike craft, then it was very much a case of where to from here, and we needed radar. The concept there was then to put some land-based radar stations along the lake from, call it Bumi, all the way through to Chetty, to Sabongwe Narrows and round to Milabisi in places, so that the land-based radar would have under control of them a couple of strike craft. So the radar operators would pick up, let's say, a target, and by radio direct the strike craft onto the target to determine what it was. Inevitably, obviously, a lot of this took place at night. So there was always the case of you trusted the radar guy to direct you onto the target, and inevitably there were weed islands floating around. There was all sorts of things giving a signal back on the radar that they would direct the strike craft to. We then identify them and say, no, it's a weed island or whatever it may be. The radar guys became quite adept at judging, call it the current flow of the water and the wind. And if everything on their screen was all going at the same speed in the same direction, you would generally assess that these were weed islands. Occasionally, and certainly just below Chetty, between Kenny's, Kangamani, those islands and things there, we would pick up radar signals, and they were going contrary to where the rest of the weed islands and things were going. So off we'd go to investigate. And most times these were actually elephant swimming between the islands, which would then be picked up on the radar. We then realized, it was at about this time I was now being posted back to Bulawayo, that we needed the autonomous aspect of a strike craft and its own radar. So the development just before I left was to get the strike craft with their own radar, increase the number of people in the boat, and that became very effective. At least then the strike craft were not reliant on land-based radar to direct them all over the place. I know of a couple of contacts that took place, nothing terribly exciting. Again, it was more a case of, I would say, to neutralize any crossings that took place. I did liaise with Ken Stewart and Ben Pretorius, who were the SB guys at Kariba, and the information they had was that we were being reasonably successful in blunting the crossings taking place. Obviously, we were based up at 2 Indep, and boat squadron ran its own sort of orderly room there, which at that stage was run by an RWS Corporal, Yvonne Hutton, very efficiently. And then our ops room was combined with the 2 Indep guys, so we obviously would talk to each other, and anything that was happening, we all knew simultaneously. At the time when I went up there, Bill Winnell was OC 2 Indep, and his 2IC was my good mate and commissioned together, Dion Creel. Shortly after that, Peter Burford took over from Bill Winnell, and we tried to establish, let's call it a joint ops room there, where we could all talk to each other and have a situation where, if necessary, we could call on 2 Indep guys to help us, maybe somewhere down on the lake or something like that. It worked very efficiently. We had good comms. There were occasions when, for example, the Army ferry, the UBIG, needed to go, particularly for the land-based radar stations, to supply them with various bits and pieces. So the movement of boats up and down on a regular basis was there. We confronted, and I say at a distance, what the Zambians had, and our main aspect was to look out for dinghies that were crossing. And I came across a group that was exiting from Rhodesia just below Chetty at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they'd already they'd taken the national parks guys in that immediate vicinity with them, forcibly put them into the dinghies, and were trying to cross back into Zambia. So various other aspects that took place. It's, dare I say it, we tried to negate the lake being used as a crossing point. Were we successful? As far as I know, we were reasonably successful. On the odd occasion, obviously, there would have been a crossing we knew nothing about, but we had to be very careful of the choke points, one being Sabongwe Narrows and the other one being Chetty Gorge. Now, just as I arrived up at Boat Squadron, the Kariba ferry had been ambushed from Chetty Island, and I think one of the tourists had been killed on the ferry. And shortly after that, I was instructed to basically defoliate the one side of Chetty facing our side, because there was only a gap there of a few hundred meters between the international boundary, as it were. So called up the necessary guys, and we went down in the Army ferry, the UBIG, with the Tetsi guys. Included in the Tetsi group was a lovely lad by the name of Jack Kerr, who had a 4.58 rifle, and sort of, without being dramatic, a World War II type of situation. The Army ferry barreled into Chetty. We had strike craft on either side, plus at the top of Chetty Gorge to protect us. And off we went as if we were doing an assault at Normandy onto Chetty Island with Jack just behind us with a 4.58, particularly if the elephant on the island took offense to us coming onto their home turf. Fortunately, there were no elephant there. Then with the Tetsi guys and the compound, I remember by the name of Haivar, was then placed from the exact ambush site all the way down that side of Chetty so that it would deny them cover. And in a very short space of time, there was absolutely no vegetation there whatsoever. And for years afterwards, it was this scar that persisted on the edge of Chetty. And did they ambush us again from there? Not that I'm aware of.
Terry, from Kariba into the urban areas, and the war did come to the cities, and in the form of bombs being carried into department stores and stuff. And you guys were involved in trying to deal with that particular issue.
Yes, obviously, explosives, demolitions, etc., is home turf for engineers. So I can't remember the exact year. Directive came from Army headquarters, and we took various people and trained them in what we called EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, which basically is bomb disposal. The criteria for the people to go on the course was you had to have done the basic, the intermediate, and the advanced explosives and demolitions, so that at least you had a fair amount of experience. In conjunction with the people who attended the bomb disposal course, again, another local development, we call it borrowed the idea from the Brits. In Northern Ireland, where obviously the homemade explosives and bombings were quite rife during their period there, they developed a machine called a wheelbarrow, which was a remotely controlled machine from within a vehicle with a TV screen, so the wheelbarrow on an umbilical cord could go to look inside vehicles and so on and so forth. So yes, we borrowed the concept of what they had in terms of developing the wheelbarrow, and we developed our own machine, which we called a Sable, semi-automatic bomb locating equipment. It was a vast improvement on what the Brits had in terms of their wheelbarrow. And on this course, the guys would be trained on how to use the Sable. And again, it had an umbilical cord, TV screen in a vehicle, etc., and fitted on the machine. There was a water cannon, there was a shotgun, and there was a grab handle and things like that. Plus, we changed the configuration of, call it the tracks of the machine, so that it could go up and down stairs. We had trained EOD operators in all the major centers, Bulawayo, Salisbury, Umtali, Fort Vic, and where there were areas that we couldn't supply, call it an EOD vehicle, there were territorial guys who were on standby should they be needed for a bomb disposal operation within that area. The Eastern Districts, Umtali, seem to have got the brunt of things here, not only in terms of, just want to confirm here, Salisbury, the Woolworths bombing took place on the 6th of August. 11 civilians were killed and 76 injured, various other things. But amongst the Meikle store in Umtali in 77, they were obviously prone to being attacked from within Mozambique. And very often there was unexploded ordnance lying around in Umtali. And my good mate, Corvus Kirshner, who was 2IC in the squadron there, I remember seeing a photograph of him disarming a 122 millimeter rocket. It was on the main street of Umtali and things. So it wasn't only parcel bombs and things. There was also other ordnance that hadn't exploded, which was in a sensitive place. And for example, the fuel tanks in Salisbury were bombed in December 78. And I remember speaking to Charlie Small. He had gone out with the bomb disposal guys to see if there was anything left there. And he saw, his definition, a satchel bomb placed on a pylon. And it obviously hadn't detonated, but it was in an extremely sensitive place. sensitive from the point of view that if the pylon had come down and so on and so forth. So Charlie, as is Charlie, he disarmed the satchel bomb and effectively saved the pylon from collapsing and doing whatever the pylon was going to do. I wasn't there at the time, obviously. There were various other bomb disposal aspects which didn't, as I say, necessarily involve a suitcase or a brown paper packet or something like that. And one of them, which I'd like to refer to, is the booby trapping of mines by the terrorists. I remember getting a signal from Army headquarters saying, be aware, terrorists are now booby trapping mines with a specific anti-lift device that appears to be a thin wire mesh on top of the mine body. We knew that this was a very sensitive mechanism because, dare I say it, we had found 3 or 4 detonations had taken place, and there were body parts which indicated that the person, the terrorist laying the mine, had actually activated it. And the anti-lift device, whatever you want to call it, had blown him and a big hole in the road. So we didn't actually know what was the mechanism that was being used, but we did know it was very sensitive and that they had killed a few of their own guys trying to lay them. So the signal came from Army saying, please, if you come across one of these, call a bomb disposal operator and let him try and determine exactly what it is that the mechanism is attached to the mine. Somewhere up Mtoko way at a given time, one of these mines was discovered. So the guys naturally pulled back and said, oh, we need to get a bomb disposal operator. My definition, the shortened version was they hunted around for a bomb disposal operator. Nobody was available. The word got back to Salisbury, and WO1 Russell Davidson, who was on leave, got the message, and typical as Russell would, jumped into his kit, grabbed his webbing and his rifle into a vehicle, and he barreled off up there to where this mine was. Did it take him a while to get there? I don't know. Anyway, he then got debriefed from the guys on the ground, and Russell then went and had a good look at this lot, and as is typical, because he wasn't very competent and very knowledgeable on it, he told the guys, move back a bit further, and he then verbally told everybody what did he see and what was he doing, so they would have the information should anything untoward happen. I believe Warrant Officer A.J. Harrison may have also been in close proximity, and Russell was talking to him and said, right, I've cleared away X, Y, or Z, and I can visually see this wire mesh. He would then give a definition that he saw the wire mesh would be completing a circuit if it hit the body of the mine, or it did this, or it did that. So a continual flow of information from Russell to the guys behind. There's 2 stories that come out now. One that I got initially was, he said there's a bit of soil between the wire mesh and the body of the mine. And where he's clearing, very sensitively, there's a bit of soil on top of the wire mesh. I am now going to blow to get rid of some of the soil to see what I can then visually see underneath the wire mesh and take it from there. Some people then say the very slight pile of soil, a small stone rolled back. We don't know. A detonation took place, and unfortunately, obviously, it killed Russell, and we had no idea how the mechanism worked. We never came across another one of those mines. So to this day, we don't know what the mechanism was. We are aware that the terrorists killed a few of their own guys laying it. It is so unfortunate that somebody with the knowledge and the experience of Russell was also killed. And Russell got a DMM, justifiably deserved, for all his work. He did an amount of work with Tony Simons and Butch Sutton at CAD, the Central Ammo Depot. And his knowledge, Russell's knowledge of explosives was phenomenal. And he was Badge Services Corps during his tenure with CAD. I do believe, and I think I'm 100% correct, he was rebadging 2 engineers, and I believe was in line for I'll call it a field commission. And I'm just sorry that this incident happened, which killed him. So when you talk about bomb disposal, we can go from a very suspect little packet that arrived in the post that Mrs. Jones said, I don't know what this is. Get the bomb disposal guys here. To a mine with an anti-lift device, to Korbes Kirchner trying to disarm a 122 millimeter rocket. So without being facetious, bomb disposal is not for the faint-hearted, and it's not for everybody. And if a guy said, hey, I'm not happy with this lot, we'd say, fine, you know, you don't have to do it. Away you go. But yes, we had full kit at the major centers, and I would say more than 90% of the incidents were false alarms. But it was comforting to know that, be it the Woolworths blast, be it the Meikles blast or whatever, there were competent guys around in all the major centers, and many a briefcase or a tog bag that had been left lying around accidentally were taken out by the bomb disposal guys.